Greetings, everyone. My name is Boysil Ndaga, and I'm a PhD student at Corvinus University of Budapest in Hungary. The topic of my presentation today is non-state actors and state building in the Middle East and North Africa region, looking at the case of armed groups in post-Qadhafi Libya. I'm going to begin by giving you an overview of my presentation. So I will start with an introduction to the topic, and then I will go into the objective and significance of the research. Thereafter, I will briefly discuss the main concepts, which are also the variables of interest for the research. Then I will give you a brief background to the Libyan conflict. I will then discuss the research method, identify the key armed groups that have played a major role in Libya after 2011, and then also introduce the typological analysis approach that I used as part of my data analysis. And then I will discuss the findings and conclude my presentation and provide a bit of insight into future work and go through my acknowledgements. So I think that we can all agree that the role of non-state actors in state building, particularly in conflict-stricken regions, is becoming increasingly important in international relations. And the literature suggests that the leading form of violent conflict today occurs within states rather than between them. The Arab uprisings of 2011 saw civil wars erupt in countries such as Syria, Yemen, and Libya, leaving these states weakened and vulnerable to newly empowered non-state actors who span across diverse groups from peaceful political and social grassroots movements to violent extremists. These groups can put pressure on fragile states by demanding accountability, justice, revolutionary change, and power. And this brings me to the research problem. After the collapse of the Qadhafi regime, there was a rapid emergence of armed groups in Libya. This was followed by intrastate conflict, where you had rivalries between groups fighting the state, proliferation of weapons, and all of these elements denies the existence of legitimate institutions to govern the country. And of course, this does not bode well for state building agendas. And that is why today, in current day Libya, it is not hard to imagine and understand the ongoing discourses and discussions where Libya is deemed as a failing state. The answer from my research is that armed groups can provide stability for state building in Libya. Of course, this requires political will. The parties involved must be able to negotiate, compromise, and cooperate with one another, particularly with regards to the rebuilding process. And inclusive state building, although it may be difficult, is not entirely impossible. Again, it requires all the parties involved to come to a point where there is a convergence of interests, particularly with regards to building a functional state and a Libya that they want to see and live in the future. This must be an internal process which is supported by the international community. So the main objective of the research was to identify the role that key armed groups have played in and the level of potential that they have to provide stability for state building in post-Qadhafi Libya. And the research is significant because no prior research has been done on Libya's armed groups insofar as establishing the potential they have for providing stability for state building. And from this research, I was able to make deductions about which groups are likely to participate more easily in the rebuilding process. And the study also contributes to research and ongoing discussions about state building in Libya. So moving on to the main concepts, I'm going to start with non-state actors and giving a definition. So the concept of non-state actors can be understood to include entities that are not actually states. And these can include terrorists, civil society, intergovernmental organizations, armed groups, religious groups, etc. Moving on to state building, the OECD DAC defines state building as an endogenous process to enhance capacity, institutions, and legitimacy of the state driven by state-society relations. I'm not going to delve too much into the definition, but I am going to discuss some of the overarching challenges to state building in Libya, which the literature identifies as mainly two. So the first one is the issue of security. And the interim government that was put in place after the collapse of the Qadhafi regime remains very fragile. It has a very limited capacity and sovereignty, and the inability to enforce security is still a problem. This makes it difficult for the new regime to build a foundation upon which advances can be made in the political and socio-economic realm. The second issue that tends to hinder state building in Libya is the matter of armed militias. And so despite the mitigation of the threat from supporters of the old regime, the interim government has no monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. Ongoing clashes and fighting between armed factions cause continued disruptions to the lives of ordinary citizens. The third concept that I'm going to define is armed groups. This is defined generally as distinctive organizations that are willing and capable to use violence for pursuing their objectives, are not integrated into formalized state institutions such as a regular army, police, or special forces, and they possess a certain degree of autonomy with regards to politics, military operations, resources, and infrastructure. Right, so now I'm going to move on to talking about the Libyan conflict, and I'm going to provide you with a brief background. The literature suggests that the Qadhafi regime, from the time of its inception, so from the time that Qadhafi came into power, he exercised absolute control over Libya. For example, the Green Book that was actually put together by Qadhafi, for example, outlined economic directives that enabled the regime to nationalize the economy in the early 70s. So by the late 70s, they had a firm grip on the economy. And also things like land distribution or wealth distribution was done very much within the regime and within Gaddafi's inner circle. So the determinants of politics in Libya have been historically based on family or tribal relations and institutional affiliations. And so any key decisions that were taken by Gaddafi, he took them surrounded by his family, revolutionaries, and tribal loyalists. And tribal alliances were a major factor in his politics. And it can also be said that this has been a contributing factor to the nature of the fragmentation that we see today in Libya, particularly with regards to the different armed factions. Fast forward to 2011, you have the Arab Spring, which originally starts in Tunisia and Egypt, and subsequently spills into Libya. There are alleged violent clashes between Qaddafi security forces and protesters. In March 2011, the Security Council of the UN passes a resolution for military intervention in Libya, which, amongst other things, enables the Security Council members to use any means necessary to protect Libyan citizens. In October 2011, Qaddafi is captured and is later killed in his home city of Sirte. And then Libya becomes fragmented, resulting in a rapid rise of armed groups. And thereafter, there also comes into being like 3 centers of government. I'm not going to go into too much detail about them, but I'm going to mention them. First of all, you have the Presidential Council, which is considered to be the unity government, and this is UN-backed, and it's based in Tripoli since 2016. Then you have the Government of National Salvation, which is basically the rival government to the Presidential Council. And then you have the authorities that are based in Tobruk and Baida, and these are aligned with a General Haftar. Right, moving on to the research method. So basically, I did a detailed analysis of a single case, which was Libya. The research was limited to looking at non-state actors' role in state building and looking at armed groups in post-Qadhafi Libya. And 7 armed groups were identified as the key players. I was able to collate, review, and analyze academic literature and official documents and draw some credible deductions about the units of analysis. And also, I applied a typological analysis approach, which was developed by an academic and researcher, Dr. Sukanya Poda, who is an expert in the field of non-state armed groups. And basically, this approach is a measuring tool to measure the stabilizing potential that armed groups have to provide stability for state building. The key armed groups that I identified, I'm going to start with Haftar and the LNA. Basically, this is a combination of military units and tribal or regional based armed groups, but it's not really a recognized army. The second one was the former Libya Dawn, which was established as a response to Haftar and the LNA, but has since ceased to exist. Then you've got the Tripoli groups, which were also major players after 2011, some explicitly supporting Libya's unity government, while the more Islamist-leaning militias tending to be a bit more skeptical of the unity government. Then you have the Misratan groups, which were considered to be Libya's largest and most powerful militias, backed by prominent political and business figures who support the unity government. Then you have the Zintan forces, who enjoyed a lot of support and presence in Libya between 2011 and 2014, but were subsequently driven out of Tripoli by the Libya Dawn. Some of these groups were once aligned to Haftar, but some of the factions have distanced themselves from him. And it is said that currently in the changing order of what is happening in Libya today, the Zintan groups are trying to find where they can be best suited and where they can find their feet in the bigger scheme of the political order. Then you have the Benghazi forces that consist of Islamist and revolutionary factions, and together with the ISIS groups, the Benghazi forces mainly fought against Haftar, but later on, the allegiance with the ISIS groups was a point of contention within the Benghazi groups. And then you have the PFG, mostly referred to as the forces in the east of Libya. In 2013, they took control of the main oil export, and they have been instrumental in preventing ISIS attacks on oil infrastructure. And basically, the literature suggests that what was once the former Libya Dawn Tripoli groups, Misratan, Zintan, Benghazi groups, were generally referred to as the revolutionary groups because they were the ones that came out strongly against the old regime. Right, so introducing the typological analysis approach, as I mentioned, which was developed by Poda. It is an approach that basically looks at the nature of support base, access to resources, relations with civilians, and the level of domestic and international support that groups have, and ultimately is then able to identify the state building potential that these groups have. The core bases can be ethnic, ideological, regional, international, for example, or based on diaspora influence. And without going into too much detail, the resource base can be cash, weapons, intelligence, mix of community-based and capital exchange systems, relations with civilians, protective, cooperative, conflicting, and then you've got domestic and international support, high and low. And once you measure all of these with each armed group, you are then able to establish a state building potential. So coming to my findings, the research showed, after a detailed analysis and review of literature and official documents, I was able to group the 7 key groups according to their core base, resource base, relations with the civilians, and the level of support that they have domestically and internationally. And the research found that the revolutionary brigades had a higher state building potential, and Haftar and the PhD presented with a lower state building potential, which is perhaps not surprising, because I think even in current day Libya, it is perhaps evident that Haftar and the LNA are a bit of a destabilizing force, and perhaps the PFG lost their support base or favor, or rather their inclination to want to be fully involved in state building, particularly after the incident where they tried to sell oil, and this cost Libya billions of lost revenue in the past. So in conclusion, I can highlight 3 major things. The collapse of the Qadhafi regime saw the state fracturing, and there was a proliferation of not only weapons, but of armed groups. Key state functions and resources were captured by different armed factions who at times have political allegiances. Armed groups fought against the state and also against each other. And this has resulted in the current situation that we see today, which further plunges Libya into the abyss. So the deductions from the findings are that the revolutionary brigades could be likely to support and participate in the rebuilding process more easily. And Haftar and the LNA being kind of seen as a destabilizing force should not be completely counted out, because as I emphasized earlier, any kind of state building agenda should ideally be inclusive and involve all the major players that are participating in the political landscape of Libya. But perhaps Haftar and the LNA may need a little bit more political incentive to cease fighting. The resolutions that I come up with in the end is that the establishment of a legitimate government, which is recognized by all. So ideally not 3 centers of government. You need one government that is legitimate and that all recognize. That is important, particularly for the way forward for Libya. And again, I reiterate that inclusive state building, albeit it may be a challenge, it's not impossible. It's something that should be internally driven by all domestic parties that are involved, and supported by the international community with as little interference as possible. So just to give you a bit of insight into future work, as I said, I'm a PhD student, and I'm building up on this research, and currently I'm interested in looking at whether insurgents governance structures that are put in place during conflict can fit into long-term state building. And finally, of course, this research wouldn't have been possible without my country's higher education and training department, in collaboration with the Stipendium Hungaricum Scholarship, which is overseen by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Hungary. which enabled me to see through this research. So this brings me to the end of my presentation, and I am happy to take any questions if there are any. Thank you very much.